appreciate your sharing. Of course, Gloria is a faithful woman of God, been that way for a number of years and had a great influence on many members of her family. We're very grateful to have Gloria and Bill a part of our Northwest Indiana family. So thanks so much for sharing, Gloria. And in the next number of weeks, we're going to give a number of you an opportunity to share some of the things that you're gaining from the lessons as well. So today we're going to be focusing about getting into the promised land. I want to give a little review here. Of course, the whole series is designed to focus on the promises of God. That God makes all these promises and he's going to come through on these promises. And specifically, we're focusing on seven beautiful promises that God makes to Abraham and then to Isaac and to Jacob. And they're very, very awesome promises. And as you follow these seven promises, you pretty much get a good understanding of the overall theme of the Bible. So we're going to be continuing that. The first promise, of course, that God made was, I will bless you. Basically, I'm going to give you all that you need. And as we know, God not only gives Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all they need, but a little bit more than that. He also blesses them in a great way. And then the second promise is, I will make your name great. And we know that is exactly what happened with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and later with Joseph. God gave them great respect from the people around them, and they became very, very famous. And the third promise God made to Abraham was, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Basically, that's a promise of protection. I've got power. I'm going to take care of you. I've got your back, Abraham. And of course, we see that come true in the life of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and later on in the nation of Israel. Then the fourth promise that God gave was, your descendants will become a great nation. Of course, that didn't start off fast. You know, it started off with 1, and then 2, and then 12, and then 70. And then by the time we get to the book of Exodus, which we studied last Sunday, there's about 2 million people in this nation of Israel. So God came through on that very unlikely promise. And now we've been focusing on this fifth promise, this promise of, I will give your descendants a promised land. God spoke that to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It was on the hearts of people. And of course, last Wednesday, we saw that the people were primed and ready to get into the promised land. God was saying, come on in. It's there for the taking. And that's what the next picture kind of indicates, that God is saying, enter into the promised land. I've got it all set up for you. I just need you to go on in there and follow my directions. And of course, we know it didn't happen. From what we read on Wednesday, we saw that for 40 years, the people were forced to wander into the desert. Now, we may be wondering, well, what happened there? Well, here are some possibilities as to why they had to wander in the desert for 40 years. This is one possibility. Moses had the map upside down, okay? But we know from the scriptures that didn't really happen. Here's another possibility of why it took 40 years. Moses is into, his Fitbit, and he's not quite at his goal of 1 billion steps, and that's why it took 40 years for the people to get to the promised land. Or this next one, which is very relatable to those of us who live in greater Chicagoland area, why it took Moses 40 years, because there were tolls, and there was only one lane, and it was exact change only. Again, we know that's not the reason why it took 40 years. Or this final one, after 39 years and 11 months of stubbornly wandering the desert, Moses' wife decides to ask for directions to the promised land. That one hits home to many of us who are married, but that's not what happened. Moses had great direction. God gave the people great direction with a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. They knew exactly where to go. The issue was lack of faith. They were not able to enter because of their lack of faith. They didn't believe it could be done. And so for 40 years, they had to wander in the desert. And so, again, after those 40 years, God is saying, okay, we're going to try this again. And so, as the next slide indicates, we're going to enter the promised land. God is saying, okay, messed up the first time. here's a second opportunity. And he's saying we're going to enter into the promised land. And that's what we're going to look at today as we study the book of Joshua. God is going to use Joshua in an amazing way to fulfill promise number 5. He's going to lead God's people into the promised land. But there's so many lessons to be learned in what I would call a very sad story of how that first generation of people weren't able to receive the promise that God had made for them. He wanted them to get into the promised land. And there's a passage in Hebrews chapter 3, beginning in verse 16, that I would like for us to read to begin with, that I think really shares with us a very, very important lesson that we need to learn from the story that we read in Leviticus through Deuteronomy on Wednesday. It says, "Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. They disobeyed, they didn't have belief, they didn't have faith. But then in chapter 4, verse 1, something that's very appropriate for us to think about as disciples now as we look back on this story and as we look ahead to what we're looking forward to and getting to our promised land. He says, "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it." This is one example of God warning us, hey, don't follow that example. So it's very obvious that God expects us to have faith. He expected it back then from the nation of Israel, and he expects us to have faith and keep that faith to the very end so that we can enter our promised land of heaven. You know, as we've often discussed throughout this series, the Bible is a book of encouragements and warnings, because as human beings with our sinful nature, we need both of those. And I think from the book of Numbers that we talked about a little bit on Wednesday night, we've been sufficiently warned. We've been warned. Here's what can happen when you don't have faith, when you're not willing to follow the plan of God. So we've got the warning part. Now Joshua is a book of encouragement. Let's get encouraged. Let's see how God works through people of faith, and let's understand how God wants to do the same thing he did back then with you and I today. It's really interesting that this new generation of people that is going to be entering the promised land, they are going to be facing the same issues as the previous generation did. They're going to be going into this promised land and encountering huge cities, walled cities, giants in some of these areas. These cities and nations prepared to engage them in war. There's lots of obstacles that this next generation of people are going to need to overcome. But none of these obstacles have ever posed any problems for God, right? And we've seen that in our studies of Genesis and Exodus. We've seen God come through time and time again, whether it was, Abraham and Sarah being able to have a child when Sarah was 90 and Abraham was 100. We've seen it in the life of Joseph, where he was cast into slavery and then thrown into prison, and yet how God brought him out of there and made him second in command in the nation of Egypt, and how God used him to save pretty much the entire world from starvation. We've seen it in God freeing the Israelites from slavery with the 10 plagues that he brought upon the nation of Egypt. We've seen it in the parting of the Red Sea, how God created a path for them to walk through the Red Sea. And then just as the Egyptian army was chasing them, God caused the waters of the Red Sea to come back on the entire Egyptian army. We've seen it in how God has provided manna and water, food for people in the desert, daily sustenance for people to be able to survive in the desert during their travels. We've seen it as God has created this pillar of fire and this pillar of cloud so people will know exactly where to go. So there's been lots of solid evidence that God has given to people that would give them the faith to believe that they can go ahead and go on in. And yet the first generation of people refused to believe. They just somehow didn't get it through their minds that God had the power to defeat the enemies that they were going to face in the promised land. But this next generation was different. And we're going to see God's power combined with what I would just call simple, ordinary faith, and how that combination leads to incredible victory. But it's not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. Never going to be easy, but still doable, right? But they would still have to listen to very carefully to what God was telling them to do. They would have to follow that plan. They would have to fight these battles, and ultimately they would have to persevere. But that's how it's always been with God, and that's how it's always going to be with God. God expects us to engage in these kinds of activities. And following the plan is not always easy, especially when it doesn't make total sense, which will happen here in the early stages of the book of Joshua. And of course, the victory is not going to take place overnight. There's going to have to be steady persistence, and that's what's going to win the day. And that's what you see in the book of Joshua. You know, it's true that good things don't typically come quickly, right? And that's the story of Joshua. It's a very good thing that they're going to get in the promised land, but it doesn't come quickly. Lots of things don't come quickly that are good, like getting in good shape. I think we all want that one to come quickly, but it doesn't. It takes time. It takes persistence. Maybe building a healthy savings account or checking account or retirement account. That doesn't happen overnight, unless, of course, you win the lottery, and then it does happen overnight, or even developing good relationships, right? That takes time, even as disciples, even in the church, where we're all kind of moving in the same direction. It takes time to build good relationships, or even having a strong marriage. That doesn't happen overnight, or especially having a mature faith. Growing and being strong for God takes time. It takes persistence. And this is where I think we often struggle as humans, because we want things right away, right? We hate things that don't happen fast. We hate slow technology. It wasn't that long ago where we were really excited about dial-up internet. Remember those days? Yeah. That's like, awesome, man. Look at how quickly I'm getting access to my internet, man. If you had dial-up internet today, you'd be like struggling big time. We want things really, really fast, but it doesn't happen that way. Sometimes we get really spoiled, right? Because we want things to happen so quickly, but that's not going to happen to this next generation of people. But I think even though that's the case, I can imagine the excitement level that they must have had as they approached the border, you know, especially those people that are 59 years old, right? Because that was the oldest people. Everybody over 20 was going to have to die in the desert. They couldn't get into the promised land. So we actually have 59-year-old people and a few older, like Joshua and Caleb, that are super excited about, okay, man, I've been waiting 40 years. I was a teenager when we should have gone into the promised land. Now I had to struggle 40 years. Thanks, Mom and Dad. But I'm 59 years old, and I am so excited to get into the promised land. I think they were super excited. And that's an important thing to realize, that excitement should always overcome nerves or fear and trepidation, that, hey, we are so excited. We believe something good is about to happen. I think even with that excitement, they knew the challenges, they knew the obstacles, but their excitement and faith overshadowed those things. You know, what's amazing to me is how two people in the exact same station of life can respond so differently. Like, one will excel while the other will fail, right? And we've seen that so many times. And it always comes down to this: which one has faith? Which one is willing to follow God's specific plan? Those are the people that are going to receive these promises of God. And now Joshua is going to lead the charge. And of course, he's a great selection, right? He's the right man for the job, because 40 years prior to this, he and Caleb were ready to go. But the other people said, no, we can't do it. So now he's being chosen by God. He's been trained by Moses. He's ready to lead the people into the promised land. But even this great man, Joshua, needs a little bit of encouragement. And so that's what we read in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1-9, as God is getting this great leader ready to go into the promised land, ready to lead his people. We read this. It says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Very inspiring words, right? Even Joshua, this great man of God who had been faithful for so many years, needed to hear these kind of words from God. Because no doubt he was maybe struggling a little bit with fear and wondering, how's all this going to happen? Even if you've been around for a long time and you've done great things for God, no matter how strong your past has been, you're still going to need regular and ongoing encouragement from God. That's why it's so important to keep reading your Bible. You know, I've been following Jesus for about 40 years. And like, man, I need to keep being reminded in much the same way that God reminded Joshua here in Joshua chapter 1. But he's inspiring Joshua. He said, Joshua, I need you to be strong and to be courageous, but not just strong, but very strong. Not just courageous, but very courageous, because Joshua is going to be there as an inspiration for the other people to join him in taking over the promised land. Now, it's interesting to think about this, that God could have got them into the promised land a totally different way. He could have eliminated all the people that were living there and made it just easy. Okay, I've taken care of business. Everybody's out of there. Go on in. But that's not how God did it. And instead of a flood like he did in the days of Noah, or instead of fire and brimstone like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah, God says, we're not going to do that this time. I'm going to expect you to trust in me, to follow my specific directions, and I'm going to expect you to use everything you have humanly possible, and then I'm going to do the majority of the work, but we're going to work together. We're going to be a team, and together we're going to go into the promised land. That's how God works. Now, obviously, you know, God always does the majority of the work, but he expects us to do our part as well. And a lot of us, we don't like that. We're like, hey, God, just do it all for me, right? You know, just pave the way, make everything as easy as possible. Like, yeah, nice try. That ain't ever going to happen. That's not the real world. We have to engage. We have to follow God's plan. God says, I'll lead you to victory. I'll do most of the work, but I'm calling you to do these things, and I expect you to do them well. So now Joshua's ready to go. And of course, one of the first things they have to do is cross the Jordan River, right? They've got a couple of million people. The Jordan River stands between them and the first big city of Jericho that they're going to have to defeat. And so we read this in Joshua chapter 3, beginning in verse 5. Of course, this is a very similar story to what happened back in the book of Exodus, right? One of the first things God had to do to get people on their way to the promised land was they had to get them through the Red Sea. Such an amazing story, an amazing event that God wanted to use to help them to believe that he could do anything. And now here's a similar situation where God is going to say, look, watch what I do here. This is going to be a clear sign to you that it ain't going to be any difficulty for you guys to get into the promised land. This was such a very, very important moment in their history. And so it says in Joshua 3, beginning in verse 5, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. So they took it up and went ahead of them. And the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, Go and stand in the river. Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. I think God likes it that way. Let's just make it a little more difficult than normal, and I'll prove to you that that's not a difficulty for me. So it's at flood stage, verse 15. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest, yet as soon as the priests who carry the ark reach the Jordan and their feet touch the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. Can you imagine the sight of that and what people must have been thinking as they saw that happening? Amazing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. What an amazing event. And it's interesting, if you've read this story, after that, God said, okay, I want you to go get 12 stones from the Jericho River, okay? Pick these really humongous stones, bring them out of the Jordan River, because we're going to set them up here, and we want people to be able to look at these stones and to remember what just happened. We want them to know the power of God. So God had something visible that they could look at on a regular basis to remember his power. And then we see in Joshua chapter 4, verses 19 through 24, as Joshua is sharing more things here with the Israelites, it says, on the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. And Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. God has his reasons for doing everything. And he says, look, I want you to remember this very significant event. And then they're on to Jericho, okay? And most of us are familiar with Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. It's the most important city in Canaan. So why not start with the stiffest challenge? Again, no big deal for God. And now we're going to see what I would consider to be a very, very big test for the Israelites and for Joshua. Would they be willing to follow the crazy battle plan that God is going to lay out for how to defeat Jericho? Because it makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't make sense to us right now, and I'm sure back then it made even less sense. So here's the battle plan, Joshua chapter 6, verses 2 through 5. And this is very significant for us, verses 1 through 5. Very, very significant for us because sometimes God calls us to do things that don't make total sense to us. But if we're willing to follow, they will work every time. So it says in Joshua 6, now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its kings and its fighting men. And here's the plan, Joshua. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in. Like, oh yeah, no big deal. Perfect. Oh, makes perfect sense. That's it's gonna be a piece of cake, right? like Joshua, no doubt, is like, wait a minute, could you repeat that, God? Are you sure that that's what you want to do with Jericho? We're ready to fight. We got our weapons. We're ready to go at it, man. We believe. God's like, no. We're gonna do it. We're gonna do a little bit differently than what you thought. Maybe you have a plan, but my plan's gonna work a little bit better. We're gonna march around the city once for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, you're gonna do it 7 times. Again, I want you to understand how challenging that probably was, and how much that required faith on Joshua's part and on the nation of Israel's part in order to follow those plans. But why not do it God's way, right? He's never been wrong before. And of course, we know the story. They did it exactly the way they were told. So it's no surprise that we read this in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in and they took the city. Well, of course they took the city because they did it exactly the way God told them to do it. You know, sometimes you and I are a bit confused with God's strategy for victory in our lives. Like, okay, turn the other cheek. When someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. Like, really? That doesn't make any sense. That's weak. That's mamby-pamby. Like, I got to fight back. God, you have power. Let me fight back. God says, no. When someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. Oh, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. That really? That doesn't sound right. I'm going to ignore my enemies. I'm going to fight my enemies. I'm going to show them who's stronger. God and his people or them. God says, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. How about considering other people more important than yourself? Really? Like, that's going to help you to get far along in life. If I do that, people are going to walk all over me. No. God's strategy is consider other people more important than yourself. Humility always wins the day. How about this? Give 10% of your income to God. Like, really? Like, that's going to help me get out of debt. Like, that's going to help me get further ahead in life. Well, that's what God says. Yeah, and see, this is what it comes down to for us, right? Are we willing to employ crazy strategy from God? Because, or maybe we have a better plan. Maybe we think our way is a better way. How about confess your sins? I'm not going to do that. That's going to get me in trouble. That's going to make me look weak. Well, God says, no, confess your sins and he'll forgive you and he'll lead you and he'll bless your life. See, all these things, we might consider them to be upside down when it comes to common sense. God says, follow my plan and things will always go better for you. When we decide to let God's wisdom prevail in our lives, we experience victories like the one they experienced at Joshua, because God's ways always work. So we shouldn't be surprised that it worked here in Joshua chapter 6. We've seen it in Genesis, right? With Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, with Joseph. We've seen it with Moses in Exodus, and now we're seeing it with Joshua. And of course, after each victory, if you read Joshua, you'll see how many rocks are being set up, right? After each victory, God says, okay, I want you to set up some more rocks, because these rocks are going to remind you of the victories that I helped you to win. And I think it's important that God was making sure that they never forgot all the great things that he had done in their lives. And I think the same message is important for us. I don't think God wants us to set up rocks. If you want to set up rocks, that's fine. But I'm talking about rocks in your head. You know, usually having rocks in your head is a bad thing, but I'm talking about having rocks in your head that's a good thing. Those rocks in your head, those are reminders as you look back at your life, reminders of all the amazing things that God has done for you to bring you to where you are. Maybe it's how God led you to become a disciple and the craziness that had to happen to bring you into God's kingdom. Those are some rocks that God wants you to never forget. Or if you're married, how God led you to your spouse, or how God kept you alive at a time when you didn't think you were going to stay alive, or God healed you of some sickness, or God provided certain needs in your life, or how God helped you to overcome a sin or a challenge or an addiction, or how God healed you, or how God answered a specific prayer request. All these things have happened to us, all of us on this call. God has blessed us in so many ways, and he says, don't forget those. Make sure those are rocks in your head. Go back and revisit those rocks on a regular basis, because they will convince you that God is with you. If you ever forget them, you could be in big trouble. And that's why God wanted them to set up all these monuments of rocks, because they were reminders to the people of how much God had done in their lives. So now, after a few more victories, Joshua pauses to remind the Israelites once again in Joshua chapter 8 and verse 34 and 35. It says, afterward, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them. Joshua is doing exactly what God told him to do in chapter 1. Make sure you obey my laws. Make sure your people know what my laws are. Make sure they never forget that I expect them to follow what I'm telling them to do. Joshua was a great leader, making sure that people never forgot that. Yeah, we're here. Yeah, God has given us great victories, but we still need to stay close to God. We still need to stay faithful. We still need to follow God's plan, because we're not totally in the promised land yet. We got a few more battles to go, a few more victories to go. And that's exactly what happened. If you read chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, God did some amazing things, even caused the sun to stand still to give the Israelites additional time to win a certain battle. That's amazing. I don't know how God did that, but he did it, and he's God, and he can do it. If he created the sun and he created the earth, he can cause the sun to stand still whenever he wants. So a lot of great things happened because God's people continued to follow his plan. They continued to stay faithful to him. And then we read this beautiful passage in Joshua 11 and verse 23. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. Isn't that awesome? There's promise number 5. You know what's sad about it, though, is that could have happened 40 years prior to that. But it didn't, because they didn't have faith. They weren't willing to follow God's plan. Finally, a new generation that had faith, that was willing to follow God's plan, and that's why God came through. God always comes through. He'll come through again and again and again. And then in Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, we read this again about how God is so faithful to all his promises. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled, because the people were willing to do their part. They didn't just say, God, do it for me. They said, God, tell me what you want to do. I believe in your power. I'm going to do my part. And I know our combination, our partnership is going to win the day. And that's why we read this passage here. We didn't read it in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy, but we read it here because we're talking about people who had faith and who were willing to follow the direct instructions of God. And then as we look at the last 2 scriptures, I think it's appropriate, especially as we consider our theme and the whole idea that God constantly warns us and constantly encourages us. I think these last 2 statements that Joshua is going to make are very important for the people then, and I think they're very important for us as well. In Joshua chapter 23, verses 14 through 16, we read this. He says, now I am about to go the way of all the earth. You know with all your heart and soul that not one of all the good promises the Lord your God gave you has failed. Every promise has been fulfilled. Not one has failed. But just as all the good things the Lord your God has promised you have come to you, so he will bring on you all the evil things he has threatened until the Lord your God has destroyed you from this good land he has given you. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly perish from the good land he has given you. Basically, all Joshua is saying here is keep going. Keep doing the right thing. Yeah, you're in the promised land, but you're not going to be here forever if you don't continue to rely upon God and trust God. And unfortunately, we know the rest of the story, right? We know what happened later on when they didn't take this seriously. God says, look, I'm going to remove you from the promised land. I'm going to make life difficult for you. He says, look, I love that you're in the promised land. I want to bless your life. I want to make your life awesome. I just need you to participate in the covenant. I need you to continue to do your part. And that's what Joshua is saying here. And then as Joshua gets ready to die, he knows he's close to death. He shares this passage that is very well known in Joshua chapter 24, verses 11 through 15. He's reminding them of all the great things that God has done. And then he brings it up to speed for them about what happened most recently in their lives. He says, then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites. But I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you. I love that, how God describes that. The hornet. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you. Also the two Amorite kings. And by the way, you did not do it with your own sword and bow. So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. Now, and here's the scripture that many of us are very familiar with. Now, fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Basically, what Joshua is saying is, we're not done yet. Okay? We still need to stay faithful. God has done a lot for us, but there's still a lot more that needs to happen. We must continue to live for God. We got to continue to teach our children. Joshua says, look, as for me, I'm going to follow God. My kids, I've taught them well. They're going to follow God. He says, but don't lose your spiritual edge, because that can happen, right? You get safely in the promised land. Things are really good. Life is nice. It's easy to forget about God during those times. Joshua says, I'm warning you, don't go there. Stay on the spiritual edge. Stay sharp. Stay focused. And if you do, hey, we're going to continue to live here, and it's going to be awesome. And it's the same message for us, brothers and sisters. We're in the promised land, you might say. We're saved. We're on our way to heaven. Okay, but we're still alive. We got to keep on being faithful to God. We got to keep on following specific instructions of God, even if they're crazy, even if they don't make any sense to us. God says, do it. And he says, if you continue to show faith, if you continue to follow me, I'm going to continue to bless you. And before long, you will be in the ultimate promised land. You will be in heaven, and you won't have any regrets that you kept your faith and that you followed instructions even when they didn't make sense. That's what heaven's going to be all about, brothers and sisters. It's going to be like, wow, we made it. We actually made it. Isn't this amazing? Way more amazing than that physical promised land. Heaven's going to be unbelievable. And we're going to go, wow, I'm so glad I didn't quit. I'm so glad I didn't give in to my own feelings or my own emotions. I'm so glad that I had relationships that helped me to stay faithful. I'm so glad that I read my Bible. I'm so glad that I prayed. I'm so glad that I came to church consistently. I'm so glad I did all that. It is so worth it. I mean, that's what we're looking forward to, brothers and sisters, but we're not there yet. So God says, keep the faith, keep hanging in there. That's the story of Joshua. On Wednesday, we're going to move into the sixth promise, the promise of kings will come from you. God made that promise to Abraham. From your descendants, there's going to be kings. Ultimately, what God is saying is, I'm going to give you the nation of Israel. You're going to be in a promised land, and then we're going to hopefully provide great leadership for your nation. And we're going to see that promise happen in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So you can look forward to that on Wednesday night. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron now. He's going to give a response and lead us into our time of communion.